Pride/Prejudice, Chapter 3, Segment 1. Elizabeth Bennet watched her sister sleep, recalling the past day's disastrous, if amusing, conversational exchanges. Jane had enjoyed her first visit downstairs, but had become fatigued and had retired early. If it weren't for Jane's potential happiness, Elizabeth would press Mamma to take her home as soon as she was able to travel. In a proper closed carriage, that could be as early as tomorrow. But meeting Mr. Bingley was the best thing that had happened to Jane in almost 7 years, since before she came out in society. There was so little to choose from in a village, and then having no portion to speak of. No, if this Mr. Bingley loved Jane, and he showed every appearance of doing so, and of being worthy of the term love, then it was Elizabeth's duty to help things along as much as decently possible. Jane's eyelids fluttered, and she emerged slowly to consciousness. "How are you feeling, dear?" Elizabeth asked. "Any better?" "A little," Jane said. "Do you think they will mind terribly if I impose on their hospitality a bit longer?" "I know one person who will be delighted," Elizabeth said. Jane blushed. "You must not encourage me in false hopes after so short an acquaintance." "If they were false, my dear, I would not encourage them. I will therefore amend my answer to say that if you leave too soon, you will endanger not only your health, but the happiness of one other person." Jane smiled and bowed her head. "And if an honest assessment allays your worries of my painting the scene rosier than I ought," Elizabeth continued, "I can say with certainty that by staying you will sow a great deal of dissension into the rest of the household, and substantially increase my enjoyment of this visit." "I think," Jane said, speaking slowly in her desire to find a way to express an opinion while avoiding taking sides and offending anyone, "you are unfair to Miss Bingley." Elizabeth grinned. "I doubt that's possible. But I was not referring principally to Miss Bingley's displeasure, but to a certain gentleman's." Jane gasped in dismay. "Mr. Bingley? But you just led me to believe—" "Oh, Jane, please, do be sensible." Elizabeth was constantly reminded how far apart their temperaments were, but grateful for the inseparable devotion that had begun, it seemed, the minute Jane had accepted her first sibling, not as a rival, but as an ally and friend. "I meant that cold, high and mighty Mr. Darcy." "Mr. Darcy?" Jane said. "Why should he mind that I am here? Surely I cannot inconvenience him." "Now there you underestimate your powers," Elizabeth said. "If you are feeling strong enough, I shall attempt to divert you and raise your spirits by relating all the conversation you have missed these past few days. When I am done, I dare you to challenge my interpretation." "Of what?" Jane asked. "Only a very interesting love affair, in danger of ending, due to one party's attempting to retain the waning affections of his beloved, and the other party's determination to assert his independence." Jane frowned in concentration, then looked up with triumph. The vivacity in her face gladdened Elizabeth's heart. Jane was truly on the mend. "I have caught you in an error, Lizzie. You have spoken of both parties with the masculine pronoun. And here I thought you were going to tell me of Mr. Darcy and Miss Bingley." "Of Mr. Darcy, yes," Elizabeth said, "but not Miss Bingley." Jane gasped again and covered her mouth. Surely Mrs. Hurst cannot be so lost to virtue that she— "I'm sure Mrs. Hurst and virtue parted ways years ago," Elizabeth said. "But no, desirous though she may be of losing her good name and her position in the world, she is not Mr. Darcy's object." "I am at a loss, then," Jane said. "Why, Mr. Bingley, of course," Elizabeth said. "You will not have had occasion to see it, confined to your bed most of the time, but I have had many opportunities to observe, and I tell you that Mr. Darcy could not be more jealous of a new bride than he is of your nice Mr. Bingley." Jane laughed, but looked unhappy. "Much as I have resented Mr. Darcy's slighting of you, and deplored his lack of both taste and judgment in expressing it, still I think it is beneath you to say such things of him in retaliation. Revenge is never justified, especially when a person must stoop to pettiness to accomplish it." "It is not revenge," Elizabeth said. "In truth, I do not resent Mr. Darcy's disdain. for after spending 3 days in his company, I see that in that trifling incident at the Meryton Assembly I have been treated no worse by him, and in some ways better, than he treats all of womankind." Jane, conscious of some inside knowledge, was moved to explain. "Mr. Bingley has apologized to me for his friend's behavior." "To you?" Elizabeth said. Jane studied her lap, unable to look her sister in the face. "He could not address you directly on this subject, after all, but with his natural kindness he knew how I would feel your hurt as my own, and he does not wish me to think ill of his friend." "Whatever did he say?" Elizabeth asked. "Only that he knew Mr. Darcy is overly severe on the subject of ladies, but that he hopes his manners will improve as he spends more time in such congenial company." "Oh, Lizzie, don't laugh like that. Those were Mr. Bingley's exact words." "I can't help it," Elizabeth said. "And I'm afraid Mr. Bingley is doomed to disappointment, as there is no improvement so far. It is all too obvious that Mr. Darcy considers none of us fit to mingle with the educated and intelligent, by which he means his sex alone. In fact, I suspect he would much prefer to inhabit an exclusive company, like a regiment of guards, where no females of any condition are allowed to sully the purity of superior masculine society." "You are just as severe yourself, you know," Jane murmured. "Mr. Bingley assures me that Mr. Darcy has an excellent character, and is a devoted and loyal friend, who has nothing but Mr. Bingley's best interests at heart." "So does a good husband have his wife's interests at heart," Elizabeth said. "Come, I will put the case to you. You shall be the judge whether I have presented a convincing argument." "Very well." Jane sat up straight in the bed and folded her hands on the bedclothes. "I would say the first piece of evidence I have to bring is a negative one," Elizabeth began. "That is, it speaks not so much to Mr. Darcy's love for his friend as to his lack of regard for women in general. When the subject of Mr. Darcy's sister arose, Mr. Bingley spoke so glowingly of ladies' accomplishments that Mr. Darcy was moved to challenge his friend's generous assessment, and most vehemently. It was almost more than I could do to keep my countenance." "But might not Mr. Darcy's words, ungallant as they appeared," Jane offered with her usual diffidence, "simply be his way of praising his sister, contrasting her merits with the deficiencies of other ladies?" "Indeed," Elizabeth said. "But he went too far, assisted by his acolyte, Miss Bingley. She imagines herself an exception, the ideal of her sex, in addition to Miss Darcy, naturally." "Miss Bingley is very elegant," Jane said. "Oh, yes," Elizabeth said, waving her hand. "She has been to a fashionable ladies' seminary, and she can afford to wear new gowns every season. But you should have heard their requirements for a lady to be considered accomplished. The inventory of scholarly achievements alone was absurd. When they started in on a certain something in her manner, and her way of walking and speaking, well, it was so ridiculous, I had to say that no living woman ever met such impossible standards. And I ask you, if such a creature existed, would she deign to marry an ordinary, flawed, mortal man? Not even Mr. Darcy himself could match her in perfection." "I imagine Miss Darcy's education and understanding are superior," Jane said. "She probably favors her brother in both beauty and intellect." "She may be a paragon," Elizabeth said, "but the inconvenient fact remains that Mr. Bingley does not wish to marry a school headmistress or a marble statue. He has that most annoying trait, common sense, and values instead goodness of heart, sweetness of temper, and because he is but human himself, physical beauty. That is, you." Jane flushed again. "Mr. Bingley does sometimes give the impression of being flighty or frivolous, but it is just his natural modesty. He really is quite level-headed."